I think this responsibility question is key and very topical with the Workday lawsuit, which is, putting some question and pressure on responsibility. At a macro level, I tend to think of it as, I feel like it's quite simple. I tend to think of other analogies like, I don't know, a car, for example, where, you've got a manufacturer, and if there's a systemic defect that's dangerous with the car, then they have liability and, might do recalls if it's found to be the case and fix it and everything. Equally, you have drivers, users using the technology, and obviously if they drive recklessly or make mistakes like that and break the law, then they're at fault.
Welcome to the HR Huddle podcast, presented by Sapient Insights Group, the ultimate resource for all things HR. It's time to get in the huddle.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the HR Huddle. I'm your host, Teri Zipper. I'm the CEO and managing partner at Sapient Insights Group, and I'm back for another exciting episode of HR We Have a Problem. This is the show where we like to break down the big and most relevant HR issues of the day. We help you make sense of what they mean for you, and we talk about the things that you might do about them. Joining me today is Jeff Pohl. Jeff is the co-founder and CEO of Warden AIi. Welcome, Jeff. It's great to have you.
Hi, Teri. Great to be on the show. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I've only recently met Jeff or made Jeff's acquaintance. So I'm hoping we can all learn a little bit more about Jeff today. You guys are doing some interesting work, and based on our first conversation, I thought our listeners would really be interested to hear more about what you guys are doing and what the market's doing in general to try to unpack and demystify AI. So we're learning a little bit more every day. It's still a little bit of a black box, I think, and we need to open it and create some practical approaches to using it. So I think we all need a little more confidence in how to approach this. So that's what I was hoping we might talk about today, Jeff. Does that sound like a good plan to you?
Sounds like a great plan. Subject I can talk a lot about. Talk your ear off.
Awesome. Then I'd say let's get into the huddle. So first off, do you want to give people a little bit more background on yourself and kind of where you grew up through and what you're doing now, specifically kind of how you got there?
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, I'm co-founder CEO of Warden AI. Now, before that, my background is in building AI technology, originally as an engineer at a number of startups, and particularly in regulated technology. So I was one of the first employees at a company called Onfido that does identity verification and fraud detection using AI systems. And so that was my kind of background into AI and into regulated technology, and kind of bringing those ingredients together into looking at how we can trust AI and regulate AI itself as we kind of go through a society into this new era of using AI more and more, but also, making sure we use it and deploy it in a beneficial way that mitigates risks.
Yeah.
So that's my background.
Yeah. One of the things I love about new technology, and, people are always worried about losing jobs, but it's things like this that come into existence that didn't really exist before, right? So we're always creating new things as a result of, something disrupting the market significantly. So I'm anxious to see how that plays out. But you guys have been really focused on bias and compliance. I know you just recently finished a report, the State of AI, Bias and TA, Talent Acquisition. How big of a concern is bias at this stage? And, what is it that people really don't trust?
Yeah. So bias among a number of other AI risks are new. Well, they're not obviously not new in terms of being around for a long time, but there's a new flavor to them with AI that wasn't there before. Like, think of software traditionally. There's not some bias risk, but not much. We're more focused on data security, data protection when we talk about software. Now with AI, with AI decision making, we have new types of risk from technology, and bias is one of them. So I think as a society, almost, we're still kind of getting our head around that and learning how to deal with it. One of the findings from our report which used a number of different sources, one of which was survey responses from HR and T leaders, identified that bias and, along with data security and data protection, were the top two most cited concerns with adopting AI-based solutions.
Yeah.
And so, and it's interesting to see how that is, because the data security and protection one, we've been developing for like last 20 years, right? From almost no regulation and awareness up until a very high degree now. And the fact that AI bias now is, in that context, similarly a high concern on people's minds already, when we're really just getting started with AI, I think highlights how big it can be a concern for many people, with good reasons, right?
Yeah. What was the most striking thing that you found in the study? I know there were one or two things that jumped out at me, but was there anything for you that was really surprising or maybe just confirming, right? That, yeah, that's what we believed, and this study really confirmed that belief.
I think one of the most interesting and perhaps controversial insights that we found is that we evaluated and we benchmark, through our own work and through other studies we can find online, we benchmark both AI bias in real world AI applications used and deployed in talent acquisition today,
Yeah.
and found the results of those. And then we compared them to benchmarks of bias in human-based hiring processes using comparable metrics. And we found that on average, the AI performed more fairly across key demographic groups, particularly sex and gender and race and ethnicity, on average. Now, doesn't mean that every single AI system's like that. Doesn't mean that AI bias is not a real issue, and that can be and demonstrably has been in certain circumstances. But the data on average suggested that AI was more fair on average than what we find in human bias in similar use cases. So lots of caveats, and you can double click on that in a few ways. But that was quite, I don't know, I maybe wasn't so surprised. I'm quite an optimist about technology personally, and we've been sort of looking at early versions of this data for a while. But I think many people, particularly with the climate we have at the moment, the news stories tend to focus on the negative side of things, I find.
Yeah.
Obviously there's a lawsuit at the moment that people are aware of, and there've been a number of issues in the past. People tend to dial in on those, and the news headlines tend to gravitate towards the doom and the scary side of things, which are important. But there's also an optimistic side. And we found the data that was showing through. Yeah,
I know that's the one big headline right now, and I'm not sure if there's a lot of others going on right now. And talent acquisition is not a huge area for me. I've never worked in it other than being a hiring manager. I've never actually been on the other side of talent acquisition, but I think I saw in your report that there's something, when it all boils down to all of the complaints, there's probably 100 that make it to lawsuits every year just on sort of, general people bias versus now we have this Workday AI, Workday versus Mobley, or Mobley versus Workday, whichever way that goes. That's the only big profile one that I know of right now. So it's kind of interesting, that we will key in on that, right? Because it's big headline news. But at the same time, if we've got one of those and we've got 100 of the other, it seems like we're doing pretty good.
That's right, yeah. So that's one of the other insights, is just looking at, we added up all the cases that we could find on the AI-related claims of discrimination in employment, which Workday is not the only one. That's by far the most covered.
Yeah.
There are a number of others, whether it's lawsuit stage or other stages, that are there, about 14 in total we came across over the last 5 years. But there were hundreds of thousands of claims to the EEOC in the US alone about, just any discrimination generally, traditional forms, of which, about 380, I think it was, had a lawsuit in the last 5 years. So it's good to put these things in perspective, and it's not news if it's not new, right? So the fact that you hear more about this one or few data points compared to the average is because it's new. And I think the other insight that you might draw from this and speculate on is, will that change over time? Right? Will it be that we have a similar number of discrimination claims that are mostly about human practices? If fast forward 5-10 years, when AI is more involved in our day-to-day working lives, we'll have a similar number that are then now AI related, because AI is involved so much, or less, or none. I guess we can conjecture. My feeling is that there's a lot more to come of this, but not necessarily because AI is worse, just because this is a systemic issue that we have anyway in our society. We just kind of learn to live with it. And now AI comes along and it creates a new flavor, maybe a new fear, but it's not necessarily going to be fundamentally different than what was there before.
Yeah. Well, it's still learning, right? From its own set of experiences, which, technically we built it. So it's whether it will learn like we learn or not, it's going to take in more data over time. And it will be interesting to see the outcome of that, right? What did it learn? And, do we have the same situation we have today, or is it very different? We don't know. It'll be an interesting thing to look at 5 years out, 10 years out.
Right, absolutely.
I thought it was interesting, though. I think your study said 85% of these solutions, sort of did pass the smell test. Did I read that right? I thought
Yeah, that's correct.
That was fascinating. I would have expected to find some more challenges there. Of the 15% that were, I don't know if you would say they were failing, but what were the things that they weren't doing well or need to fix?
Yeah. So that data point was specifically on it's called fairness metrics, impact ratios, adverse impact scores against sex and race demographic groups that we were able to compare against a number of different systems and also humans. And so, we found that 85% of AI systems were above the 4/5 rule, the 0.8 impact ratio, for those who know the details here. So we're, essentially, when we compare, say, male, female, or all the different groups, were close to being, equally treated, and 85% were above that threshold in AI systems. So the ones that failed were below that threshold for one or more demographic group. So that maybe there's maybe a group, that was more, according to data, potentially more disadvantaged than others than that key kind of 0.8 threshold. So that's what that data point meant. Which, to be fair, doesn't mean there's definitely overt AI bias going on. Those metrics are quite broad in the way they work, and so it could just be randomness, or it could just be that was actually sort of just based on the data that was available, that was correct, not actually unfair and biased. That makes sense. So it's not a simple conclusion, but if you're below the thresholds, then it's an indication that there might be a bias issue going on.
Yeah. I also thought it was interesting, just the sheer numbers of people that are using it already. And mostly this was primarily around the TA use cases, right? But, I also read a resume builder study that was, more than a quarter of companies were already using AI to conduct the entire interview process, which I thought was fascinating, because I'm trying to put myself in this. So I haven't had to interview for a job in a long time, but trying to put myself in the interviewee spot where I've only ever connected with, an AI agent to get this job. That was fascinating to me.
Yeah, it's quite, in some ways, impressive or surprising or shocking how fast these things are changing.
Yeah.
Obviously, those are probably more a smaller group of people at the cutting edge, but we work with a number of companies that are doing AI interviewing. Typically, it's like first or second stage and not the full thing. But for lower skill roles, you maybe don't even need to meet anyone at all. And the reason we end up doing a lot of customers, and we do a lot of work in the talent acquisition space in AI, and did this report on that area, it's not because there's not other exciting opportunities for AI in HR generally, or there are important risks. It's just that we see, because there's such a volume challenge in talent acquisition, it's such a great place for AI to be used effectively at scale, but also with of course high risk as well of getting them wrong. So I find that some of the conclusions that we're finding in that space are maybe a forerunner of what we'll see transpiring in kind of back of the front line, if you will, in other HR practices and processes and use cases, bringing AI into it. I feel like the TA one is the the front line of that we can maybe draw lessons from and see how it plays out, and that will maybe be similar in many ways as it kind of propagates through into other processes.
Yeah, yeah, it really is. I mean, obviously, given the magnitude, the numbers of, candidates that people are screening and just the ways that they're going out these days and looking for talent, right? You're looking beyond just the people who are replying to or filling out resumes for jobs, right? You've got to look at the entire market. But I would have thought that, something like compliance and some of these other areas would have felt a little less risky for the risk averse, to start in. So I'll be curious to see. I mean, again, TA has been the number one use case, I think. And that's where you guys have been really focused, is on that process. But what do you see as the next big area? And are you guys starting to dig into that already?
Hi, I'm Carmen Hudson. I'm the host of the Recruiting Book Club, and we're starting our second season. I'm so excited to bring to you another set of guests of recruiters who have written books. We are excited to have some very special guests this season. We've got Shally, we've got Craig Fisher, James Ellis, and quite a few other people that we're going to bring on board to tell us about what they wrote, why they wrote it, and maybe we'll veer off into a conversation about recruiting on all types of topics and subjects that happen in our industry. So I hope you can join us. I'm excited.
Yeah, it's a good question. There's definitely a lot of interest in AI in the HR space generally. I think that the thing, well, there's quite a lot going on in terms of chatbots and sort of, again, frontline like HR work, people asking sort of everyday questions about policies and things like that we're seeing quite a lot of AI in. In terms of our world, we're at the intersection of AI and compliance and risk and trust of AI systems. So there's quite a lot of AI use cases that are maybe quite useful that are not, they're also low risk. And so we don't end up getting involved in those because, the downsides are not so severe.
Yeah.
Or they're too high risk and no one's really doing it or not doing it in a big way. So, some people are looking at some interesting things around performance management using AI, for example, or compensation. But, the risk is perhaps so high there, and it's so sensitive that we've not seen a huge amount of, advanced AI being used in those places yet. But things are changing so fast. I may be out of date and maybe not aware of certain providers. So yeah, that's kind of what we're seeing.
Yeah. So you work a lot with the vendors because it's really about using your technology to test their platforms and help them understand where there might be issues or things that they need to look into. When you think about that vendor's responsibility as it relates to their clients, how do you see that playing out? Because obviously they're critical in this process, but I think there's also a little bit of a gap between the vendor's responsibility and the communication they do during the sales process, and then how that information trickles down to the end users and what their understanding of, what they're using and how it's being used, or what the impact of it is through their day-to-day work.
Absolutely. I think this responsibility question is key and very topical with the Workday lawsuit, which is, putting some question and pressure on responsibility. At a macro level, I tend to think of it as, I feel like it's quite simple. I tend to think of other analogies like, I don't know, a car, for example, where, you've got a manufacturer, and if there's a systemic defect that's dangerous with the car, then they have liability and, might do recalls if it's found to be the case and fix it and everything. Equally, you have drivers, users using the technology, and obviously if they drive recklessly or make mistakes like that and break the law, then they're at fault. And so, ultimately it's the same. It should be the same in the AI space, right? You've got potential systemic ways technology is put in place in a platform and a vendor, and so they have responsibility to do it correctly. Equally, technology is operationalized, customized by individual companies and the end users there, and they have responsibility to make sure that that's aligned to the guidelines and everything else. So I think both are it's important for both to kind of get it right. And I feel like that's what we're seeing starting to happen in the market as well. It's just been a very gray area. I suppose it still is a gray area.
Yeah.
But hopefully we'll work out a clearer definition of that. And I think that a lot of vendors are responding positively to that. We are seeing, and that was one of the findings in the report too, that yes, there's a lot of room for improvement in terms of being ahead of AI regulations and governance practices and audits and all these things. But we are seeing a lot of vendors take it seriously and do more than the minimum to make sure they're ahead of doing this in a good way.
Yeah.
So we're getting there.
That's a great analogy. You can't be reckless in your driving after you learn how to drive, right? But I think that comes back to organizations, right? They're using more AI to some extent, in some cases, using it and not really understanding how it's impacting things or, what they need to know. And I do think it's going to be, there's a new industry there of how do we help organizations and the end users understand how to use the technologies responsibly. Obviously, that's a big topic right now, responsible AI. And so, it's going to come down to the individual. And it's, obviously that's a pretty big governance issue for organizations to make sure that people are using it in the way that it was intended, right?
Absolutely, yeah. That's definitely an important and growing space. I feel like there's a long way to go, but people are, hearing more and more of AI governance committees, responsible AI committees, educational programs going on in organizations to help bring that up. And again, both are important, right? We need to make sure the core technology is built safely and with the right safeguards in place, but also we can't assume that's the full thing. And anyone who's using these high risk systems needs to be, have the right literacy and understand how to use it correctly and then make sure that it's deployed in the right way.
Yeah. What are you seeing organizations do, just from the perspective of how they work with the vendors and how they are going through? Obviously people are buying new technology every day, and right now they're probably at least evaluating it at a high clip right now to see what they're getting from an AI perspective or to see what they can get. Do you have some guidance or advice for people in terms of, new questions that they need to be asking the vendors, or, what is the conversation they should be having with vendors to make sure that they know what they're getting and that they aren't getting a black box, that they understand what they're getting, they understand the organization or the vendors, responsibility, their responsibility. What are some of the things they need to be thinking about as they're going through some of these evaluations?
Yeah, so it's a big topic and an important one. What we're seeing that I think is good and would encourage if others to do, if not already, is to make sure it's cross-functional. So if you're an HR person, HR leader, looking at this kind of software and AI solutions, to make sure that there's legal and IT and risk involved as early as possible. We're seeing that yes, there's growing procurement hurdles which can be painful and annoying, but also if brought in early and done correctly can then lead to a good outcome, overall.
Yeah.
So I think that's important. And a lot of this comes down to getting your hands on the right documentation. And that's an area that we also found in our report that vendors are been investing more in, is good documentation. And increasingly, we see people have what we call an AI explainability statement. Slightly confusing title, I think, personally, but a big document that breaks down the AI, how it's put together, how it should be used, etc. So that's a key thing to ask for, something that shares that gives an overview of it. Going deeper into the risk, and particularly if it's a talent decisioning type system, like we've been referring to, one that might be in the Workday lawsuit, for example, I think it is important to ask more difficult questions about how they mitigate bias in particular, and moreover, how the vendor would help in the case of a claim, right? Like the claims, we don't necessarily go to the worst case scenario, but as we just mentioned, like claims are quite common, right? Discrimination claims alleged or valid. Anyway, they need to have good answers in place for how they would help you resolve a claim if it came up. And I think that's important to ask and dig into as well. So yeah, those are some of the areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important that people, you got to think about who are the other people involved in the organization. And I would say, even if you don't know the questions to ask, like bringing it up and sort of pushing the conversation, even if you're not sure, you know, what the best question is. Engage your legal and engage IT. My question for you, who owns this right now? Who are you seeing as the owner of this type of this piece of the puzzle, right? Is this IT stepping up? I'm seeing more and more HR being asked to carry the mantle, but obviously there's so many stakeholders within the organization that no one group is going to do this alone.
Yeah, in fact, the thing I'm seeing the most is that there's no clear owner persona. At the moment, I'm seeing fragmentation.
Yeah.
Yeah, HR in some cases, IT in some cases. I'm seeing we see a lot of legal. That might be slightly on our leaning in terms of what we do and what we come across.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, a lot of these legal teams don't know, aren't familiar with AI, particularly.
Yeah.
Maybe have a data privacy background or something like that. And so there is a gap there. Sometimes we're seeing some of the problems that we come across from the vendor side is that they get asked questions that they can't answer that well because the person, even though there's good intent behind them, doesn't understand enough about AI and the regulation related to AI, but just knows you need to ask something. So
Yeah.
I think there's a piece and something we're working on as well as how to structure that, how to what are the right questions to ask, and to help both parties kind of communicate and overcome those things. So yeah, definitely seeing the same thing of different people getting more involved and learning more about AI risks and how to manage them.
Well, and I mean, the vendors, I think I'm seeing some of them step up. I don't know if you're seeing that as well, but, rely on your vendor, bring them into the conversation because they're going to know probably a lot more than you do just because they're developing it, right? They're responsible for knowing what legislation is coming, right? Because they've got to bake that into their next iteration. So,
Yeah,
you should be able to rely on them to at least help you with the think through it. Who are the right people to be talking to? What are the questions that I need to ask? That kind of thing.
absolutely. Yeah, and that's something else I should have mentioned is there's a number of different frameworks that are emerging that can be useful to ask about or follow fully. For example, there's
Some
an
cheat
ISO
sheets.
framework. Yeah, but a bit more than that. But there's an ISO framework, ISO for 2001.
Yeah.
That's about AI management processes. It can be applied particularly on a vendor, but also as an organization deploying an AI system. So very much on processes, not so much on outcomes. Like this is actually demonstrating that AI behaves in XYZ way, but it's about these processes around the way that AI is developed and managed. So, and that's something that people can demonstrate compliance with. They can have an auditor like check that. So I think that framework or some of the other regulations that exist, like New York City has a local law 144, Colorado's got an AI Act coming out, asking vendors whether they're compliant, or perhaps more importantly, if what their solution is to the different requirements of those frameworks. Could be a good way to guide the conversation. Sometimes it can create confusion because some of those regulations are maybe signed but not well defined yet. So, for example, there's one in Europe, the EU Act, big regulation, very expansive, but the definition of, besides the actual law itself, definition of the standards underneath them hasn't really been done. So it can also create confusion. But overall, I think a worthy exercise is to kind of ask about those regulations and some of the requirements and where the vendors are on them to help guide the conversation if you're not sure.
Yeah. Are you seeing at the vendor level, are they helping the front line, like the people who are out there doing demos or the account managers and those roles, the sales leads, are they getting more educated on, how AI is working so that they can be that conduit, or are there other experts in the organization that are getting built out that they're relying on to help them with those types of initiatives?
Yeah, so we're definitely, I would say Yes, I think so. I think there's still a gap because it is something that's so new and not everyone is super familiar with. But yes, I think some people who are getting it right are being more proactive about it generally. So some of our, and that's something that we actually work with the vendors we work with too, is to help them through our software, but also just in general in terms of advice, help them talk about AI risks early in the process.
Yeah.
So rather than being like waiting for maybe the sale to go ahead and then someone in procurement like raising problems, then we see vendors take it seriously and then ultimately do well because of it, bring it up themselves early on and say like, this is a high risk system, this is some riskier, but here's what we do to mitigate it, and bring that into the sales conversation, to the demo, even to make it clear and help people get on the right page with it. I do think though overall it does often fall back on tech and legal teams inside the companies, beyond the salespeople. But I think that's always the case, right? It's natural. There's a deep expertise that gets involved in when it gets into the tougher questions from legal teams and that sort of thing.
Yeah. But what I like about what you guys are doing is, and I think this is important for buyers to know, is you're giving that third party review of what the vendors are saying, really testing their solutions to make sure that they're meeting the threshold, right? And giving them advice and guidance on making sure they are going down the right path, staying within guidelines, meeting regulations. So, I'm looking to people, buyers, and saying, make sure your vendors are getting a third party review of what they're doing. Like, trust but verify, right?
Exactly. Yeah. No, that's we didn't explain too much about us in the intro, but yeah, we essentially audit and certify that AI systems in HR technology are fair and compliant to use. So yeah, that's something that people can ask about. Is there a third party that's audited in the system? In our case, we have badges, and people tend to be quite public about us. So it's like, here's the dashboards and reports from Warden AI that support our fairness and compliance here. So that's something that people can also look out for or ask about as well. And not to say if someone doesn't work with us that they're not trustworthy, but we try and help bridge that gap with our approach.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's good to have that third party review, because to me, that we talked at the beginning about opening the black box. To me, that's what, starts to open that black box and give you, much more comfort that you're buying something that is, it's matching what it says it does, right? And because we think we police bias in our day-to-day lives through work, it's harder to do when you can't see inside the box. So having that, I guess, sign off or certification or whatever you want to call it, at least gives us another level of comfort that it's doing things the way that we would expect.
Right. I think to go back to the car analogy, it's a bit like you got manufacturer of cars, but then there's also various other entities that get involved. And I'm not, my knowledge of car manufacturing is a bit limited, but getting involved to stress test and test, right? They don't just rely on the manufacturer themselves, and that's it alone. And so it's a similar approach here, as AI does more and more risky things, maybe not in this context leading to damage, physical damage, but still harms nonetheless. And so that third party perspective, at least we think, is an important part of the overall puzzle and overall process to develop trustworthy systems in the space, and hopefully help everyone adopt and move forward with it with confidence that everything is okay to use and get the benefits without the risks.
Yeah. Is there anything I didn't ask you about today that you think is important for people to know or to be thinking about? Or, is there something that you would leave the audience with that you think would help them with this particular challenge?
Covered a lot. You did your research. Good questions. I think, I think it's an interesting time, right? Because we have a lot of pressure from, the business to use AI. Everyone's like a buzzword, it's hype and everything to get benefits. At the same time, there's material risks. I overall encourage people to adopt to embrace change. I always, there's definitely risk, and that's what we're involved in mitigating them. So I'm not denying them. But I think in some ways the biggest risk is to do nothing at all, and not adapt, not change, not embrace technology where it might be useful. So yes, take it seriously, manage those risks, ask about them, mitigate them, but don't just sort of hear a news story that has a negative view on AI and then bury the head in the sand and not take it, at least consider it. That tends to be, I think that's, history teaches us that doesn't go so well.
Yeah.
People need to kind of accept and embrace change in the right measure, responsible way.
Yeah. I would say just don't wait for somebody else to do it, or don't think that, just because your role is not responsible for this, that you shouldn't at least be asking the questions and trying to understand as well. Because I think when we, at the end of the day, we look at HR and any of sort of the staff functions, right, are going to be a much more, a group of strategic leaders, analysts, drivers, more so than, doers, because, we're looking to AI agents to, replace that basic work. So we all need to be looking for where are we going and how do we help support that, and how do we grow in our role. I'm really encouraging people to, take what, use ChatGPT, great. Use Gemini, use one of the other tools to start to learn and get to know what you need to know. But take a class, and at least start to understand what some of the potential implications are for yourself and for your organization, and how you can be a part of this, right? Because it's coming, just like every other, new technology revolution that's taken place over the last, hundreds of years. So, get on board, right? And learn what you can. I don't think there's no harm in doing that. And there's always, greater good the more you learn.
Right. Another thing that I think too is that don't be disillusioned if change is not as fast as you think, right? So there's a lot of, how people tend to think things are going to happen, or the changes are bigger sooner than they actually are. They tend to take these technological changes, revolutions from the past, tend to take it longer than people realize to see the big gains, the big improvements. So quite easy to get a bit excited, maybe try use AI for some things, and then maybe a bit disillusioned by it because it doesn't actually solve everything. That doesn't mean to say it's not still going to steadily get better and ultimately have that impact. It just actually takes deceptively long to kind of come around to that. So it's a marathon, not a sprint. It's maybe the message there.
It does. But I also think it's easy to get complacent about it, right? And then the next thing you know, you're caught off guard when, the work you do is replaced, or, something that if you're a small business, you suddenly don't have a market anymore. So yeah, I think now's the time to learn as much as you can, and maybe be on the front line of where this thing all goes. Yeah, it's gonna be some interesting times.
Very interesting.
I'm excited about it. Yeah.
Great time to be alive.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Jeff, for joining me today. This has been a great conversation. I hope people enjoy it. Where can they find you online and on social media?
Yes, I'm on LinkedIn. My full name's Jeffrey Pohl. We're warden-ai.com, and you can email me at jeff@warden-ai.com.
Awesome. Well, I also want to thank our producers, Brand Method Media Group, and our marketing team, and also want to thank you for tuning in. Be sure to listen next week while Stacy and Cliff spill some tea on HR tech. That's all the time we have this week for this episode of HR We Have a Problem. If you enjoyed the episode, you can subscribe to it on your favorite podcast app or leave us a review. We'd love to know what things you'd like to hear more about. You can also drop us a line on the website and let us know what topics you want to hear about. We will be back in 2 weeks with another episode of HR We Have a Problem. Thanks, everybody.